this is an unusually rich passage, and there is a lot going on, so much so that pretty much every thread of meaning throughout the Gospels kind of meets up together here when Jesus and Pilate face each other. And I think you'll see how that comes together shortly. But before we really understand what Pilate is doing and why he is interacting with Jesus like this, we have to realize what Pilate is there for. He was a Roman governor, and he was placed in Judea for one reason only: to make sure that people kill each other as little as possible. This place tend to be pretty violent. The Jews specifically resented Roman occupation, and they resented the Greeks before them. And so because the area of the world, that area of the Mediterranean, was so important, Rome had a very, very acute interest in keeping things relatively quiet. It was an important trade route. It was an important way of shipping grain to and from, like the Greek and Roman areas down to Lower Egypt. They just needed it to be relatively calm. Now, Pontius Pilate, as it turns out, was not very good at this. He was known for having a temper, for being relentless, for being just kind of a miserable person to be around. And he didn't last all that long. I think it was a total of about 11 years. And he was pulled out of Judea by Rome, I think about 6 or 7 years after he executed Jesus. And his reign was pretty troubled. Before he got there, his predecessors did an okay job of ruling and keeping things relatively quiet while also respecting the Jewish sensibilities that we would read about, for example, in the Old Testament. Pilate, not so much. So when he first got there, one of the things he did was he brought in with his soldiers, like these golden shields that had these images on them, images of Rome. And if you know anything about the Ten Commandments, one of them is you shall not make a graven image. It's against the law of Moses. And so, of course, there were protests, and there were protests actually in the city of Jerusalem and surrounding the temple, and Pilate circled around them all of these soldiers, ready to kind of call in the dragoons and have a splendid slaughter. But eventually, the Jewish protesters, in just a brilliant move, said that we cannot have our place, our sacred area, desecrated by denying the law of Moses. And so they stretched out their necks and said, you're going to have to just kill us. And at that point, they kind of forced Pilate's hand, and he backed off, and they got their way. Now, eventually, Pilate, like I said, was pulled out of Judea because there was a Samaritan uprising, and that would be just kind of north of Judea. And the reason being is that, the reason they pulled him out was that in the wake of this Samaritan uprising, he put it down so brutally that even Rome was like, bro, you need to slow down. And if Rome itself is thinking, hey, maybe that was a little too much, a little too violent, you have a problem. And so he was sent off into exile, and it's not really clear what happened to him after that. But I guarantee you it did not go well. But so with that in mind, remember that Pilate has to keep the peace as best he can. And if peace is not possible, he needs to establish peace as quickly and efficiently as possible. So, beginning in verse 28, and if you'd like to follow along, you might find that helpful. John writes, "Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor." Now, we've got like a flag on the play, even though it's weird for me to be using a sports metaphor, and that is that when John says the Jews, he does not mean all of the Jews in their entirety, or the entire nation of Judea, or all of the children of Abraham. That's not what he means. He always has in mind a specific set of people, and he just so happens to use the shorthand to call them Jews. And it's up to the reader to figure out what exactly he means. Often, he means the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. And then the question is, well, which ones? And there are a couple of groups. And I bring that up because it's kind of my pet peeve. The book of John has been used to justify a lot of anti-Semitism and that kind of thing, and that's sort of odd because John himself was profoundly Jewish, and he wrote in a very Jewish way. So I just, that's my own pet peeve. You'll deal with it. By now, by now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So entering into the home of a Gentile makes you unclean. And it was not uncommon for Pontius Pilate to conduct his business either late in the evening or early in the morning when it was cooler. Now, during this time, because it was so close to Passover, Pilate had moved his headquarters to the fortress Antonia, which overlooked the temple complex. Because during Passover, the Jewish people would observe the time when they were slaves in Egypt and God rescued them from slavery and set them free. Now, if you're going to get like heady nationalistic ideas in your head and you're going to get a group of people to start a riot because you hate and resent these Roman overlords, you might going to do that during Passover, as we say in Texas. You might could do that. And so Pilate would move to the fortress Antonia. He would bring a whole bunch of extra soldiers as the population of Jerusalem swelled quite a bit. And so tensions were high. They had to be vigilant in case a riot broke out and then that spread, and then Pilate would be in trouble with Rome. So you get this sense that, all right, a bunch of Jewish leaders, and in this case, the Jews mean the chief priests, the elders within the temple, and we'll talk about them in just a second. They come to Pilate, and they've got this guy that they've arrested. So you can kind of hear Pilate going, "Here we go. All right, guys, let's keep it civil." So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" And they reply, "If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Now, if you notice, they didn't answer the question. It's like asking my 4.5-year-old, "How did that mess happen?" "Well, the kitty was over there and she was wanting to go outside," and that kind of thing. Hey, answer the question. You're skirting it. What are you hiding? And so then Pilate calls them on it, and he says, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone." The Jews, remember, these are the chief priests, the temple folk. The Jews objected. This happened so that the words of Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Now, this might raise a question for some of you, which is, why are they insistent on getting Jesus executed? And under Roman law, only Rome can execute. And the reason is this. Jesus has been going around talking about this kingdom of God, that it's not an actual literal kingdom like so many in his day thought, but rather it's this reality that's breaking through. It happens when the poor have the good news preached to them, and those cycles of poverty are broken. When the blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk. When the people in power and abusing power are laid low, and the people who are low are brought high. That's when God is in charge. And these chief priests, if Jesus was right, and that's what the kingdom of God looked like, and Jesus was in fact the Messiah, these chief priests will lose everything. Because to get into the role of chief priest, and especially high priest, you need to be in bed with Roman power. The high priest was a purchasable office from Rome, and it was not cheap. If you were a chief priest, more than likely you learned how to skim off the top of all the money kind of cycling through the temple. They were corrupt. And if Jesus is right, their days are numbered, both in terms of their prestige and their wealth. So they have plenty of motivation to get Jesus executed. So then Pilate goes back inside the palace. He summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That's an odd question to ask. Nobody asked him about it, and Jesus is going to call him on that. So we might ask, why would Pilate just start off with, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Well, the answer is actually really simple. Like I said, Pilate was there specifically to keep the peace, to make sure the Jews were in their place. And for them, keeping the peace, or for the Romans, meant eliminating all threats to Roman security, safety, and interests. So if you were a threat to Roman power or authority in some way, then you would be taken care of. So if Jesus is going around truly saying, I am the King of the Jews, and using this very charged messianic language, then he actually would be considered a threat to Roman security. And then, well, that does not go well for him. So Jesus responded, is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate said. He's like, please, this is not my fight. Just answer the question. It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it that you've done? So Pilate's trying to see if this Jesus guy is actually a threat to Roman security or if he's just sort of some traveling nut job. And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, said Pilate. And Jesus answered, you are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Then Pilate asks, well, what is truth? The first postmodern. So Jesus responds with an explanation that, my kingdom, it doesn't originate in this world. It's a different kind of kingdom. It's a kingdom that's based in truth. And all Pilate cares about is that first part. All right, when you were arrested, did your followers actually start a riot? Well, there was that one guy that hit the guy with the sword and cut his ear off, but I guess that's just beside the point. No, this is not a military expedition. This is not a group of fighters. So at this point, Pilate does not care. What is truth? He dismisses this Jesus' fanciful religious language because he doesn't care. It doesn't matter. You can have your own strange Jewish ideas. You're not going to start a war. That's all that matters. So with this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews with scare quotes? They shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now, Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. And that is actually a good translation. Other translations and other accounts, they would say, like, Barabbas was a robber or a thief. And you got to realize, like, if you're in Roman custody, it's not because you stole stuff. It's because you were considered violent and you were considered a threat to Roman security. So like when Jesus is crucified and he has two thieves, one on either side, do you think Rome is going to go through the entire day-long process of crucifixion because some people stole stuff? Of course not. They were more than thieves. They were brigands. They were revolutionaries. And the word that Matthew uses to describe them, leistoi, confirms that. They were Robin Hood types, robbing from Roman travelers along the road and trying to incite some kind of rebellion. Barabbas would have been something like that. Now, there's an interesting detail here, and part of it has to do with the way John writes. As a good Jewish writer, a name is rarely ever just a name. There's always some kind of meaning behind it. And for Barabbas, that's especially true. And if you read the New Testament and you see somebody with the name that begins with B-A-R, B-A-R is Aramaic for son or son of. So you would separate that out. Bar, son of, Abbas, Abba, father. And in a really, really interesting twist, you have the fake son of the father, Barabbas, going free, while Jesus, the true son of the Father, is taken into custody. A very powerful switch has just taken place. So then Pilate took Jesus, even though he's convinced that he's innocent, and had him flogged, because you can't appear weak. And then the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, the King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know I find no basis for a charge against him." So Pilate is stuck. People want him executed, but at the same time, Pilate in his investigation thinks this guy's innocent. He's not a threat to Roman security. But his job is to keep the peace to an extent. And so there's a little political game here going on. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, "Here is the man." And this is John again doing a little play on words, a little stylistic trick. It's called remez in Hebrew. This is the man. Not like this is the guy. This is humanity. This is all of humanity in one person, all of Israel in a single individual. The entire course of human history and God's woven narrative throughout comes here as this guy who is beaten and bloody and is being betrayed by his own people standing before the people he came to save. So as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him," which they can't. It's his way of saying, stop it. "As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." And the Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" I don't have a good, robust explanation for this, but something happened in the way that he and Pilate interacted. Even though Pilate thinks, all right, so he's just sort of a religious nut job, but he's not violent. He's like, you talk about truth. What is truth? I don't buy it. Something happened. Something about their interaction, something triggered fear in Pilate's heart. And it has something to do with him maybe starting to realize Jesus is more than just a kook. That he's claiming to be the Son of God. He has some kind of powerful presence about him. What's going on here? "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. It's kind of a general rule in human communication that the silent one is the one that controls that conversation. And that's why in a relationship, for example, silence is so toxic. It's worse than anger. Because it's a power play, it's a mode of control. But Jesus doesn't feel the need to speak. He knows who he is. He knows where he comes from. He's the one that is voluntarily giving himself up. He could get out of this at any time. But he just doesn't speak. "And do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" He's puffing himself up. He's trying to make the power play back as Jesus is standing there quiet, taking control of this. And he's saying, "I'm the one with the power here." And then Jesus sticks him. Says, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above," which is true. "Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." So Pilate has this run-in, this encounter with Jesus. But then they say the words, these chief priests say exactly what Pilate needs to hear. They're saying, he's claiming to be a king. Do you oppose Caesar? You're no friend of Caesar's. And the whole point of Pontius Pilate's job is to make sure the people, even if they're grumbling it and saying it through their gritted teeth, yes, Caesar is king. We are friends of Caesar, because then they're not going to rebel. So Pilate has a choice. This man, he's convinced is innocent, and there's something else really weird going on here. But I'm also getting what I need in order to keep my own neck. What do I do? And then when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. And it was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. There's a little bit of snark or biting sarcasm here. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him. "Shall I crucify your king?" And then Pilate asked, "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest answered. Now these are chief priests, they're not stupid. They've been raised with the stories of their people. They know Torah forwards and backwards. They know the history, or their history, as being children of Abraham. The entirety of the Hebrew Bible could be summed up with the statement, God is king. Who's in charge around here? God. Who is the creator? God. Who is the one who rules over all kings? God. Who is the true king? God. But in their desperation to keep their interests, they sell out their entire history. They sin by denying the truth that God is king, and they say, "We have no king but Caesar." Pilate gets what he wants. They violate the corest part of who they are. And this is the sin that Jesus literally dies for. This is what seals the deal. And so it says, finally Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Now there's, looking back, a lot of regretful things that happen here. But I think we can take two things away from this story of Pilate that really apply in a deep way. The first is that regret never happens in a vacuum. You never find yourself like regretting this decision and it was just this one-off, completely disconnected thing that you just made a bad decision at some point. Bad decisions always come from a series of bad decisions. Like with Pontius Pilate, his goal is to keep the peace. And there's nothing wrong with keeping the peace. There's nothing wrong with playing the game politically and trying to engage some kind of compromise, meet me halfway sort of thing. That's all okay. But at some point, you start bouncing against the borders of what might be ethical, the borders of what might be right or true. And eventually, you find yourself saying, what is truth? Look, there's something going on with you, but I'm going to get what I want, so I'm going to not do that. I'm going to do the thing that I'm pretty sure is wrong because I get my way. Now, as a pastor, when I've been meeting with people who are caught up in this regret, they've made some huge mistakes or this thing in their lives has gotten completely out of control, it is never, 100%, never just the result of a one-off decision. It's always, every single time, the result of some things that happened that started maybe a decade ago. Just little things here and there that start to push on some boundaries, push on some things that, it's kind of gray, but okay, it seems okay, and then eventually it grows and grows into this almost addiction or this monster, this demon in their lives, and they find themselves acting in ways they never thought they would. And that's true of you and it's true of me. Regret does not happen in a vacuum. The things that we come to regret are always things that grow over time. It is a process and it is a cycle. And the second thing that we can pull from this story and talk about regret is with Jesus. Did you notice how many times Jesus disrupts the cycles that were playing out? Pilate wants to push on Jesus, and Jesus at any point could have stopped this. He could have said, hey, you know what, I honor your emperor. Caesar is my king. I am no threat. I only hail to the king of Caesar. He would violate who he is, of course. But Pilate would have been like, all right, why don't you go out the back door and I'll just shoo these guys off. It would be over instantly. Which is why Pilate was like, don't you know I can kill you? It's like, just tell me that you're not a threat. Jesus, however, in in knowing who he is, in knowing what God has made him to be, in knowing that he has a mission, he refuses. He disrupts this cycle. He doesn't bow to the powers that are pushing him to make yet another regrettable decision. He throws Pilate off of his power-tripping game. He disrupts the regret swirling around him. And this is the ultimate truth about regret. I don't know of a single follower of Jesus who has been baptized into his death and raised into the new life he offers in resurrection. I don't know a single follower of Jesus that has not already had that cycle of regret broken. I know plenty who may not feel like that. I don't feel like that. Not always. Not often, sometimes. But it doesn't make it any less true. That's what Jesus is doing as he willingly gives himself up into custody, refuses to enter that cycle of regret, and goes to his death. When John says, "Here is the man," here is also the regret, the cycles of regret, the decades-long addictions, the things that crush us at night when we realize that we are not who we thought we are, not who we want to be. Because it has already died in Jesus. You are already made into something else, something much closer to what Jesus wants you to be, the way that God sees you. In your regret, however that has played out in your lives, know that Jesus has already defeated and destroyed it, and that those cycles of regret are already broken, even if you don't know it yet. That is the power and promise of resurrection. It is already true. Let's pray.